Gender roles in Hamlet and how they impact society.
Hamlet by William Shakespeare has strong themes of misogyny, toxic masculinity, and sexism, which can teach us many lessons about the impact societal gender stereotypes have on individuals. The play tells us toxic gender roles can cause distress, misery, and in extreme cases, lead to death.
In this video essay, we'll discuss how gender stereotypes have changed since the Shakespearean era, how they've stayed the same, and how the characters meet or fail to meet gender roles.
Part 1. Gender roles, Elizabethan era versus present day. While we still share some similarities about gender stereotypes with the Elizabethan era, thankfully Western society has made some progress over the past 400 years. Today, it's common for women to have jobs, own property, make their own decisions, and much more. And men's mental health is a big topic of discussion, now more than ever. Compared to the Elizabethan era, around the time of the Salem witch trials, where women were burned at the stake, they couldn't own property unless they were a widow, and some of the only jobs open to them were maids, midwives, bakers, and seamstresses. The start of this was the Age of Enlightenment, where there were many breakthroughs in art, literature, and culture, which caused education to become more universal and accessible. This caused a major shift in morals and ideals. The moments in our history that made the biggest difference between the 1600s and the present day were the late 1800s and early 1900s. This was where women were able to go into male-dominated jobs, like lawyers in 1879, were able to own their own property in 1884, obtain the right to vote in 1919, and much more. Women to gain independence from the men in their lives and do typical masculine things. When comparing this to the rights the women had in Hamlet, we see a big difference. For example, we see Gertrude and Ophelia being abused and used as bait, with little to no choice, for Claudius and Polonius to spy on Hamlet in Act 3, Scene 4 and Act 3, Scene 1. While men's roles haven't changed quite as much as women's, we still see a bit of a difference. For example, studies estimate that over 7 million fathers in the US identify as stay-at-home dads, which would have been seen as a woman's job or unmanly in the Elizabethan era. While fathers were expected to be loving and kind to their wife and children, they weren't supposed to actually take care of them except for financially. It is also shown in many of Shakespeare's works, like Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet, that fathers had complete control over their wives and children. In the 1600s, it was also socially unacceptable for men to show specific emotions, like sadness, fear, hesitation, and much more, shown in Act 1, Scene 2, when Hamlet is grieving for his father's death, and Claudius says,
"Thy father lost his, and the survivor bound in filial obligation for some term to do obsequious sorrow. But to persevere in obstinate condolement is a cause of impious stubbornness."
Part 2. Comparing then and now. Are we stuck in the past? Shakespeare's Hamlet shows us many examples as to how men and women were stereotyped in the 16th century, which can be compared to our society today. First and foremost, it's clear women were treated as lesser beings than men. Women were viewed as inferior, weak, and incapable, which Hamlet himself states in a soliloquy from Act 1, Scene 2.
"Let me not think on't. Frailty, thy name is woman."
Or in Act 5, Scene 7, when Laertes claims the woman will be out of him when his tears are gone, which is yet another example of how women were viewed in this era. Today, some people still hold views like this, including public figures such as Andrew Tate, who has publicly voiced his opinion that men are stronger, smarter, and generally more capable than women, time and time again. Another recurring stereotype was that women are continually defined and judged by their physical appearance. Compared to men, there's a notable focus on the bodies and beauty of women. In the play, this was demonstrated several times, even if in quick and subtle lines, including Act 5, Scene 7, when Gertrude describes Ophelia as mermaid-like when she drowned, and many other instances.
"Oh, do you, pretty lady?"
Every one of the characters defines Ophelia as beautiful, and it's by far the most noted virtue of hers, as opposed to her kindness, loyalty, or respectfulness, for some examples. This intense focus and judgment on women's looks is still apparent. Take President Trump for an example, who has a very long history of only seeing women for their looks.
Donald Trump said the following about you, quote, "Look at that face. Would anyone vote for that? Can you imagine that, the face of our next president?"
Another stereotype. In Hamlet, women are morally degraded for being sexually active or making decisions that defy traditional standards, even if they're the same as men. Throughout the play, Hamlet shames his mother regularly for remarrying as soon as she did. He concludes from this that all women are promiscuous, generalizing them. Women were told to remain virgins and were thought of as unpure if they weren't. This was a total double standard, as men weren't expected to be abstinent. In Act 1, Scene 3, Laertes tells his sister Ophelia to refrain from sleeping with Hamlet as it will ruin her reputation.
And weigh what loss your honour may sustain if with too credent ear you list his songs, or lose your heart, or your chaste treasure open to his unmastered importunity.
In today's society, women are still criticized by men, and other women, for doing the same things men are not shamed for, and sometimes even applauded for. But men are stereotyped as well. It was clear in the Elizabethan era, and sometimes seen in the 21st century, that men should remain strong and unemotional to be considered masculine. Men are often mocked or teased for opening up. Seen here in Act 2, Scene 2, when Hamlet is laughed at by his friends when he confesses he's depressed.
Why did you laugh then when I said man delights not me?
This is still a huge problem. Male suicide rates are almost 4 times higher than female rates in the Western world. This is largely because of the stigma associated with men being emotional and letting things out. So just these few examples go to show how similar current society and gender stereotypes are to those of the 1600s. Now let's explore how specific characters meet and fail to meet these stereotypes.
Part 3. Characters meeting gender roles or not. The characters in Hamlet are prime examples of people obeying and disobeying gender roles in the Elizabethan era. Characters like Ophelia, Claudius, and Polonius follow the gender roles assigned to them, while characters like Hamlet and Gertrude reject the gender roles. I'm going to be focusing on Ophelia and Hamlet and how they obey and disobey their gender roles. When taking a look at Hamlet's character from the untrained eye, he may seem to be following his gender roles. In the Elizabethan era, it was more blatantly obvious when a woman would rebel since they were kept under such tight constraints. It can be harder to differentiate if the male in that time period was following gender roles as strictly. Hamlet is emotional, discusses his feelings with people, and isn't a naturally violent person. All of these factors don't align with the gender roles men were expected to follow at that time. The plot of Hamlet is driven by the murder of King Hamlet by Claudius and Hamlet's desire to seek revenge. While Gertrude was able to remarry Claudius less than 2 months after the death of King Hamlet, without seeming to have any emotion about it, Hamlet did not have a similar reaction. Throughout Hamlet, we see how strongly Hamlet was affected by the death of his father, his emotions ranging from sadness to questioning the meaning of life to anger. Claudius tells Hamlet 'tis unmanly grief, and he is shamed for continuing to grieve his father's death almost 2 months after his passing. In the Elizabethan era, it was not seen as manly to be emotional, and Hamlet is looked down upon for these emotions. When Rosencrantz and Guildenstern make fun of Hamlet while he is confiding in them, as mentioned before. Hamlet has nobody taking his feelings seriously, and he is not even able to share how he feels with his closest friends. Men were not supposed to confide in people in that way, and Hamlet is expected to be strong enough to figure out his emotions on his own. Lastly, Hamlet does not have the natural violent instinct that men were expected to have. When Polonius is killed, Laertes immediately tries to seek revenge violently. After Hamlet finds out his father was murdered, it takes him a while to build up the courage to try something violent against Claudius. This causes Hamlet a lot of intense self-hatred and makes him feel weak and useless. Ophelia is an example of a woman following gender roles in the Elizabethan era. She is seen as the female beauty standard, and she follows men's orders. In Hamlet, it is shown that obeying gender roles can bring its own sense of power. When Hamlet is going insane, it is thought to be because of Ophelia rejecting him. The characters believe that Ophelia's beauty and virtue has the power to drive Hamlet in and out of sanity. Upon her father's death, Ophelia is left feeling lost and insecure, bringing her into madness. It seems as though Ophelia feels comfortable within the system she has been brought into, since it is all that she has known. While Hamlet and Laertes react to the death of their fathers by seeking revenge, Ophelia instead gets driven into madness, leading her to commit suicide. This demonstrates how back then women were seen to not be able to control their emotions, while men are strong enough to withstand the pain and instead seek vengeance.
After taking a closer look at the play Hamlet, we can gather that strict gender roles can cause insanity, lead to depression and potential suicide, and are detrimental to society.